Heavenly Stories.
The land of Israel lay under the heavy boot of Midianite oppression. For 7 years, the Midianites, along with their allies, swarmed like locusts, raiding crops, stealing livestock, and driving the Israelites into hiding in caves and mountain strongholds. The people cried out to God, desperate for deliverance. In the small village of Ophrah, a man named Gideon, from the tribe of Manasseh, was threshing wheat in secret, hiding it from the Midianites in a winepress. He was no warrior, just an ordinary farmer, the least in his family, which was itself insignificant in his tribe. Yet, God saw something in him that Gideon couldn't see in himself. One day, as Gideon worked, an angel of the Lord appeared, sitting under an oak tree. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior," the angel declared. Gideon froze, his hands trembling as he gripped the threshing tool. "Mighty warrior? Him?" He turned, squinting at the stranger. "If the Lord's with us, why is all this happening? Where are the miracles our fathers told us about?" His voice carried frustration, years of hardship spilling out. The angel's gaze didn't waver. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel from Midian. I'm sending you." Gideon's heart pounded. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't brave. "My clan's the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family," he protested. But the Lord's voice cut through his doubts. "I'll be with you. You'll strike down the Midianites as if they were one man." Gideon, still unsure, asked for a sign. That night, he prepared an offering, a young goat and unleavened bread, and placed it on a rock as instructed. Fire sprang from the rock, consuming the offering, and the angel vanished. Gideon fell to his knees, trembling. God had spoken to him, and nobody from Ophrah. But doubt lingered. He needed more proof. That night, God gave Gideon a task: tear down his father's altar to Baal and the Asherah pole beside it, pagan symbols that had crept into Israel's worship. Gideon obeyed, but fear gripped him. He waited until dark, gathering 10 servants to help. Under the cover of night, they smashed the altar, cut down the pole, and built a new altar to the Lord. By morning, the village was in an uproar. "Who did this?" the men of Ophrah demanded. When they learned it was Gideon, they stormed his father's house, calling for his blood. But Joash, Gideon's father, stood firm. "If Baal's a god, let him defend himself," he said. The mob backed down, and Gideon earned a new name, Jerubbaal, "Let Baal contend with him." Word of Gideon's actions spread, and the Spirit of the Lord stirred in him. He sounded the trumpet, calling the tribes of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali to rally. Men came by the thousands, ready to fight the Midianites. But Gideon's faith wavered. He laid a fleece before God, asking for signs to confirm his calling. First, he asked that dew fall only on the fleece, leaving the ground dry. God did it. Then, Gideon reversed the test: dew on the ground, fleece dry. Again, God answered. With each sign, Gideon's confidence grew, but God was about to test his faith in a way he never imagined. The Midianite army, vast and menacing, camped in the valley of Jezreel, their camels stretching beyond count. Gideon's army, now 32,000 strong, gathered at the spring of Harod. He looked out over his men, feeling the weight of leadership. They were outnumbered, outmatched. Yet, God had promised victory. As Gideon surveyed the camp, preparing for battle, he didn't know that God was about to turn his world upside down, stripping away every ounce of human strength to prove that the battle belonged to him alone. Gideon stood on a hill overlooking the spring of Harod, his 32,000 men spread out below, their campfires flickering in the early dawn. Across the valley of Jezreel, the Midianite army sprawled like a dark sea, their tents and camels blotting out the horizon. The Israelites were already outnumbered, their odds grim. Gideon's heart thudded with a mix of resolve and fear. God had called him, given him signs, but leading an army against such a force felt like walking into a lion's den. He tightened his grip on his staff, whispering a prayer for strength. Then, the Lord spoke, his voice clear in Gideon's mind, "You have too many men." Gideon blinked, certain he'd misheard. Too many. They were already outmatched. But God's words were unmistakable. "If I give you victory with this army, Israel will boast, saying, 'Our own strength saved us.' Send home anyone who's afraid." Gideon's stomach churned. He trusted God, but this? He climbed a rocky outcrop and addressed the men, his voice carrying over the camp. "Anyone who's trembling with fear can leave now and go home." He braced himself, expecting a few to slip away. To his shock, the camp stirred like a disturbed anthill. Men began packing, their faces pale, muttering about the Midianites' numbers. By midday, 22,000 had left, their footsteps fading down the hills toward home. Gideon watched, his throat tight. Only 10,000 remained, a fraction of what he'd started with. The Midianites still outnumbered them 10-1, maybe more. He turned his gaze to the valley, the enemy's campfires glinting like mocking eyes. Surely, this was enough, he thought. God wouldn't ask for more. But God wasn't done. That night, as Gideon walked among the remaining men, the Lord spoke again, "There are still too many. Take them to the water, and I'll sift them for you." Gideon's heart sank, but he obeyed. He led the 10,000 to the spring of Herod, where the water sparkled under the morning sun. God gave strange instructions: "Watch how the men drink. Those who kneel and scoop water with their hands, set them aside. Those who lap like dogs, keep them." Gideon stood by the spring, watching as his men approached the water. Most knelt, cupping water to their mouths, drinking slowly. A few, only a handful, dropped to their bellies, lapping the water quickly, their eyes darting around, alert. By the end, Gideon counted, 300 men lapped. The rest, 9,700, knelt. God's voice came again, "With the 300 who lapped, I'll save you. Send the others home." Gideon's knees nearly buckled. 300. Against an army of thousands. He looked at the small band of lappers, their faces weathered but resolute. They were no elite force, just ordinary men, like him. He dismissed the 9,700, watching as the camp emptied again, the sound of departing feet like a fading heartbeat. The 300 stood by the spring, unaware of the task ahead. Gideon's mind raced. He'd seen God's signs, felt his presence, but this felt like madness. Yet, deep down, he knew this was God's way, stripping away human strength to show his power. As night fell, Gideon gathered the 300, their eyes fixed on him. He didn't know how God would do it, but he clung to the promise: the battle was the Lord's. The night was thick with tension as Gideon and his 300 men camped near the spring of Herod. Below, in the valley of Jezreel, the Midianite army lay like a sleeping giant, their tents stretching endlessly, their camels snorting in the dark. Gideon's small force was a speck against the enemy's might, 135,000 warriors, armed and ruthless. The 300 stood ready, their faces lit by flickering torches, but Gideon's heart wrestled with doubt. God had reduced his army to nothing, yet promised victory. How could this be? As Gideon paced the camp, God spoke again: "If you're afraid, go down to the Midianite camp with your servant Purah. You'll hear something that strengthens you." Gideon's pulse quickened. Afraid? He couldn't deny it. The weight of leading even 300 against such odds pressed hard. He called Purah, a loyal servant with steady eyes, and together they crept down the hillside, cloaked in darkness. The Midianite camp sprawled before them, a maze of tents and campfires, the air thick with the smell of smoke and livestock. They moved silently, avoiding sentries, until they reached the camp's edge. Crouching behind a pile of supplies, Gideon overheard two Midianite soldiers talking by a fire. "I had a dream," one said, his voice low. "A loaf of barley bread came tumbling into our camp, struck a tent, and it collapsed." The other soldier's eyes widened. "That's no ordinary dream," he whispered. That's Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God's given him victory over us. Gideon's breath caught. Barley bread. The lowest of grains, like him, the least of his clan. Yet, God was using it as a sign. His fear melted into awe. God had sent him here, to this moment, to hear this. The enemy was already trembling, convinced of their defeat. Gideon's faith surged. He and Purah slipped back to the Israelite camp, his heart pounding with purpose. He gathered the 300, their eyes gleaming in the torchlight. "Get up," he said, his voice steady. "The Lord's given the Midianite camp into our hands." He shared the dream, and the men's faces lit with resolve. They didn't need numbers, they had God. Gideon divided the 300 into 3 groups of 100, handing each man a trumpet, a torch, and an empty clay jar. The plan was simple but strange: surround the camp, hide the torches in the jars, and wait for his signal. As they moved into position, Gideon felt a calm he couldn't explain. The Midianites were vast, but God was greater. The 300 spread out, encircling the camp's edge under cover of night. Gideon gripped his own trumpet and jar, his eyes fixed on the enemy below. The battle wasn't about numbers, it was about faith. The moon hung low as Gideon and his 300 men took their positions around the Midianite camp. The valley below pulsed with the enemy's presence, tents packed tight, camels snorting, and the low hum of sleeping warriors. Gideon's heart beat steady now, the fear replaced by a fire kindled in the enemy's camp. God had shown him the Midianites' fear, and now, with only 300 men, he was ready to act. Each man held a trumpet in one hand, a clay jar hiding a lit torch in the other. The plan was God's, not his, and that was enough. Gideon split the men into 3 groups, positioning them at different points around the camp's perimeter. The darkness was their ally, cloaking their small numbers. He gave clear instructions: "Watch me. When I blow my trumpet, you blow yours. Smash the jars, raise the torches, and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon." The men nodded, their faces set with determination. They didn't question the strange strategy, they trusted their leader, who trusted God. At the start of the middle watch, just after midnight, Gideon gave the signal. He blew his trumpet, its sharp blast cutting through the silence. The 300 followed, their trumpets blaring in unison, a deafening roar from every side of the camp. With a crash, they smashed their jars, revealing blazing torches that lit up the night. "For the Lord and for Gideon," they shouted, their voices echoing across the valley. The Midianite camp erupted in chaos. Warriors stumbled from their tents, eyes wide with panic, seeing fire and hearing war cries from what seemed like thousands. In the confusion, the Midianites turned on each other. Swords clashed as they mistook allies for enemies in the dark. Camels stampeded, trampling tents and men. Gideon's 300 held their ground, blowing trumpets and waving torches, amplifying the illusion of a massive attack. The enemy's fear did the rest. Thousands fled, tripping over each other, abandoning weapons and supplies. Gideon watched, awestruck, as God's plan unfolded. Not a single Israelite sword had been raised, yet the Midianites were defeating themselves. As the enemy scattered, Gideon sent messengers to the tribes of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, calling them to pursue. The men who'd been sent home earlier now joined the chase, cutting off the Midianites at the Jordan River. The victory was swift, undeniable. By dawn, the valley was littered with abandoned tents and the bodies of the fallen. Gideon's 300 stood, torches still burning, unscathed. The battle hadn't been about numbers, it was about God's power, proven through faith. As dawn broke over the valley of Jezreel, the Midianite army was a shattered remnant, fleeing in all directions. Gideon's 300 stood amid the chaos they'd unleashed, their trumpets silent, their torches dimming in the morning light. The ground was strewn with abandoned weapons, overturned tents, and the tracks of panicked camels. Not one of Gideon's men had fallen. The victory was complete, miraculous, and undeniable. The Israelites who joined the pursuit returned, their voices raised in triumph, chasing down the last of the Midianite stragglers. Gideon led his men across the Jordan, pursuing the Midianite kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, who'd escaped with a small force. Exhausted but driven, Gideon pressed on. In the towns of Succos and Penuel, he asked for supplies, but the elders refused, doubting his success. "You haven't caught those kings yet," they scoffed. Gideon promised they'd answer for their lack of faith later. His small band pushed forward, catching the king's remnant by surprise. Zebah and Zalmunna were captured, their army destroyed. On the return, Gideon dealt with Succos and Penuel, fulfilling his word. Israel hailed Gideon as a hero. They offered him kingship, saying, "Rule over us, you and your sons." But Gideon refused. "The Lord will rule over you," he said, pointing them back to God. He asked only for a share of the gold from the Midianite spoils. With it, he made an ephod, a priestly garment, meant to honor God. But the people, prone to wandering, turned it into an idol, and it became a snare for Gideon's family. Peace settled over Israel for 40 years, but the seeds of future struggles were sown. Gideon returned to Ophrah, no longer the fearful farmer hiding in a winepress. He'd seen God's power, led 300 to victory, and delivered his people. Yet, he remained a man, flawed and human. His story spread, a testament to what God could do with the least, when faith trumped fear. The 300 had stood against thousands, not by their strength, but by God's. The battle was never about numbers, it was about trusting the one who called them.